Investing is as simple or as complicated as you would like to make it. There are plenty of very successful investors who just put money away every 2 weeks into broad market index funds, but there are people who are interested in finding great companies and looking for market-beating returns. It really just comes down to, what is your risk tolerance? What is your appetite for this? How much time do you want to spend on this?
Hello, friends. This is Tyler Gardner welcoming you to another episode of your Money Guide on the Side, where it is my job to simplify what seems complex, add nuance to what seems simple, and learn from and alongside some of the brightest minds in money, finance, and investing. So let's get started and get you one step closer to where you need to be. Before we get into today's episode, quick personal announcement. I wrote a book. 3 years of your questions, finally in one place. It's called Real Wealth, published by Norton, out December 1st, and if you pre-order this month, you're automatically invited to a free live event on May 6th, where I'll answer your most asked investing questions exclusively for pre-order buyers. So go to tylergardner.com, pre-order, click the button that says you did, 2 minutes, you're in. Now, let's get into today's episode. Today's guest is someone who I've been looking forward to connecting with for a long time. Because before I ever had a podcast, before I ever had a newsletter, before I ever created one video on Instagram or TikTok about personal finance, before any of this, I was listening to this guy in my car every single day. Chris Hill spent nearly 26 years at the Motley Fool, where he created and hosted Motley Money from its very first episode back in 2009, building it into one of the most listened to financial podcasts in the country, airing on over 75 radio stations nationwide, and hosting over 3,500 episodes along the way. He co-created 5 shows about money and investing, interviewed everyone from Malcolm Gladwell to Mark Cuban, and became the narrator of Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money, as you all know, one of my all-time favorites, which hit number 1 on Audible's nonfiction list. He is now the creator and host of his own show, Money Unplugged, and he is, without question, one of the most important voices in financial media over the last 2 decades. So I'm thrilled to offer you one of my favorite conversations to date with Chris Hill. First of all, thanks so much for spending the time today, because I have mentioned this to you before, but I grew up listening to Motley Fool, and I actually say, grew up in a relatively literal way. And you joined Motley Fool in 1997 with no background in finance that I could find, communications degree, theater work in college. And then when the company was genuinely struggling during the 2008 financial crisis, you pitched starting a podcast as a type of lifeline. So did you believe in that moment that this would work, or were you just throwing ideas at the wall during a scary time for the company?
I'm glad you mentioned that it was a scary time, because I think it's easy, as the great financial crisis gets further and further in the rearview mirror, it's easy to forget how genuinely scary it was for the U.S. economy, and in particular for financial companies. And the Motley Fool is a financial company. And when you're in the business of providing investment research for people, and not just a bear market hits, but a genuine crisis like this, you start to lose customers. People get scared. We had produced a radio show between 1998 and 2006. And so at the end of 2008, as the market continues its slide and our business continues to suffer, it really was a time of just throwing ideas against the wall. And so my boss at the time said, should we, be doing a radio show again? And I said, give me a day to think about it. And I wrote up what ended up being a 5-page memo, longer than I meant it to be. But I figured I'm going to write this and he's going to share it with the other executives at the company. And it basically boiled down to, we should try a podcast before we try a radio show again. We had experience in radio. Podcasting was a relatively new medium. It really was a sense of, we're going to try this for a month and just see. we'll do a weekly podcast for a month. And we launched it in February of 2009. And after about a month, we were encouraged enough to say, all right, let's give it one more month. And after 2 months, the numbers were going up. And so at that point, we thought, all right, this is something that we feel like we're doing a good job of, and we're differentiating ourselves. Because there were other financial podcasts at the time. The Wall Street Journal was doing some. They were just talking about investing in a different way than we would talk about it around the office at the Motley Fool. And this is one of those things that comes under the umbrella of desperate times call for desperate measures.
Well, and you mentioned a couple times in that response that you were intrigued by doing a good job and you were going to see if you could do a good job, and also that you wanted to talk about investing in a different way. What was the way that you wanted to differentiate the Motley Fool from some of the more traditional financial outlets at the time?
I was the communications director at the time, and I sat near our investment analysts, and I had no formal training in finance. I did not take a single class in college around investing or economics or anything like that. I learned about investing working at the Motley Fool and
That's incredible.
spending time talking with our analysts and learning how to evaluate a business. And so when the analysts would talk amongst themselves or I would talk with them, we talked about investing and businesses and CEOs. It was much more like the way people talk about sports.
Yeah.
And the people who were doing podcasts for Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal and others, they were just talking in a much more clinical way. I think they were producing their show for a different audience, probably a more professional audience on Wall Street, whereas we were just talking about stocks and businesses for everyday individual investors.
Well, and then it became so popular, as you know, so clearly something clicked with that way of communication, and people and listeners clearly grabbed onto that. And then in January 2010, Motley Fool Money became the first podcast that I know of to make the leap to broadcast radio. And at one time, I believe it aired on 75 radio stations. And so we hear constantly in investing about a first mover advantage. Did you have any sense in 2009 that the financial podcasting was going to become what it became?
No, is the short answer.
Yeah.
We definitely benefited from being one of the first financial podcasts that had a somewhat well-known brand behind it, as opposed to just individual people just popping up their own shows. Podcasting was more expensive to do back then. It was more complicated, but you benefited from less competition. There were fewer shows. But no, there was no sense that it was going to become as big as it was.
What were some of the shows that you listened to intentionally at this time, and either to kind of use as models for what you kind of wanted to do, or antithetical shows of something maybe you said, I've listened to this show and we want to differentiate from this one?
There was definitely some of that. And in a way, that was when we were starting to do the research around what type of show did we want to do, and I was putting that memo together, I started listening to other financial podcasts just to see, well, what is the landscape like? And again, some of the bigger names in finance were doing intelligent shows. They just weren't talking the way that we were talking. So there was that was part of it in terms of how we were programming. We're big sports fans at the Motley Fool, certainly myself and a lot of the other investment analysts. And so the long-running ESPN show, Pardon the Interruption, the way that show was hitting headline topics, because Motley Fool Money, and when we started a daily show called Market Foolery, which was shorter, more like 12 to 15 minute episodes. And it was very news driven. It was sort of like, well, these are the 2 or 3 big headlines of the day. And so we wanted to sort of take that approach of, let's talk about them intelligently, but let's not ramble on and take too much of people's times. As the host of the shows, the other podcasts that I would listen to, and this is still the case, are interview podcasts. I started to listen to, someone like Elvis Mitchell, who is a film critic in California, who hosts a weekly show called The Treatment. And is still, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best interviewers of the last 20 years. And so aspirationally, as I was trying to get better as a host, I would listen to these other shows and start to pick up on the prep that the hosts were clearly doing, the ways that they were asking questions, giving space for an answer, and pushing back when necessary.
This episode is brought to you by LMNT. My sister's a marathoner who treats LMNT like a food group. When I told her I was partnering with them, she called me for 17 minutes. The first 10 were enthusiasm and catching up. The last 7 were logistics about how many boxes I could get to her and how quickly I could do it. I've also mysteriously been reconnecting with a lot of old cycling friends. Years of radio silence, and now my phone seems to be buzzing. It's wonderful, genuinely touching, but each call seems to end the same way, with some variation of, "So what's the LMNT sponsorship situation exactly?" followed by their giving me an unprompted shipping address. Anyway, actual news, and for salt monsters like me, my sister, and my cycling crew, it's outstanding news. LMNT just launched Pink Lemonade, a limited time flavor available exclusively to LMNT Insiders. 500 milligrams of raspberry powder, sweet, slightly tart, naturally pink. I love it. I'm also still completely obsessed with mango chili, which I will be drinking until they pry it from my cold, adequately hydrated hands. Now, to become an insider, all you need to do is order the Insider Bundle, 4 boxes for the price of 3. Best value they offer, and you get early access to flavors like this one, plus surprise gifts along the way. So, instead of calling me, congratulating me, and then giving me your mailing address, go to drinkelement.com/Tyler. Become an insider, get the pink lemonade, and if my sister calls, just know she's been working on her pitch for weeks. That's drinklmnt.com/Tyler. This week's episode is brought to you by Fabric. Studies show the average American spends more time researching a refrigerator purchase than their life insurance coverage. This is not a criticism. Refrigerators are genuinely complicated, but a refrigerator does not keep your family financially solvent if you die. Priorities perhaps worth revisiting. Term life insurance is the financial task that lives permanently on everyone's to-do list right next to clean out the garage. Important, not urgent, and therefore never done until something happens, and then it's the only thing that matters. So if anyone relies on your income, this is not optional. It's step 4 in my financial order of operations for a reason. The question isn't whether you need it, it's whether you've actually done it. Fabric by Gerber Life makes this embarrassingly easy. 10 minutes online, no health exam, no phone calls, no guy with a laminated brochure. $1 million in coverage can be bought for less than $1 a day, especially if you're young and healthy, which is exactly the window where this is almost unreasonably affordable. And if you're thinking your work policy covers this, go look up the actual number. 1 to 2 times your salary disappears the day you change jobs. That's not a plan. Fabric has nearly 2,000 5-star reviews on Trustpilot. It takes 10 minutes to sign up, so go to meetfabric.com/Tyler and cross this off the list so you can feel confident knowing your dependents are covered in the event of a true emergency. That's meetfabric.com/Tyler, meetfabric.com/Tyler. Policies issued by Western Southern Life Assurance Company, not available in certain states, prices subject to underwriting and health questions. In some of the interviews, I mean, clearly, again, something worked very well with how you learned or the mentors from whom you were learning, because within your career with the Motley Fool, you interviewed Malcolm Gladwell, Michael Lewis, Dan Pink, Becky Quick, and Mark Cuban, among, obviously, I could list this for the next 5 minutes. But out of that group, who surprised you the most? Kind of meaning, who walked in as one thing in your mind and walked out as something completely different?
Out of the ones that you mentioned, I think that something that people like Dan Pink, Michael Lewis, and Becky Quick all have in common, and what struck me pretty quickly is just how normal they all are. That they are, Michael Lewis is on the short list of the best nonfiction authors in America. Dan Pink is probably on that list too. I think Becky Quick is probably the most underrated person in financial news when it comes to television over the last 15 years. And all three of them are very comfortable just talking to you about the normal thing that you would talk to anyone at a backyard barbecue about. Dan Pink lives in Washington, D.C. and is a hardcore sports fan. So I'm sure if he joined the conversation right now, he would be eager to talk about the upcoming season for the Washington Nationals.
That's great. It's funny that you mentioned that because my wife and I just completed a cross-country road trip both to Arizona and back within a span of a couple months. And so we had plenty of time to listen to an abundance of podcasts. And after listening to about episode 3 of a Tim Ferriss special on the way back, we turned to each other, and regardless of who the guest was, at first, we had been kind of excited to hear what their morning routines were, and then ultimately said, I think they're describing what most of us do when we wake up.
Right. Right.
I don't mean to disparage the interviews, but at some point I got, are we really oohing and awing over the fact that they have coffee and then feel good by 10 a.m. and do a morning workout? I go, I think that's what a lot of us like to do.
Right.
And among others you've gotten to connect with, and this one really fascinates me for very personal reasons because this is the equivalent of my personal finance Bible. Is you got the opportunity to narrate Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. The audiobook hits number 1 on Audible's nonfiction list in 2023. That book is basically required reading for personal finance. What is it like to be the voice that got to narrate that particular text? And I'm also interested in knowing what stood out to you either about that book or about Morgan Housel, where you agreed to do this project and were excited to do so.
So I'll get to what stood out in the book in a second. Let me give you a little bit of background, because Morgan wrote for the Motley Fool for a bunch of years, and that's how I got to know Morgan. And so I, among others, was encouraging him to write a book. Which is easy for me to say. I'm not the one who has to write the book. I'm just the guy off to the side saying, you should write a book.
I'm sure he's pretty thankful for that advice now at this point.
Yes, but at the time, it was Morgan in the late 2010s was putting together this idea for the book and not getting any traction. He was getting frustrated. And I remember having coffee with him one day, and he was just so frustrated that he was saying, I don't think I'm going to write this book. And he did that thing that we all do where we're looking for excuses to not do something. We just start throwing up all the reasons not to do something.
Oh, yeah. I've got a list of those right next to me if you ever need a couple more.
Yeah. And this was 2018. He said, well, and audiobooks are a thing now, and I'm never going to narrate a book. And without thinking, I just said to him, I'll narrate the book. Don't worry about it. Just write the book. I'll take care of it. I'll do it for you. Having never narrated an audiobook before.
Yeah.
In March of 2020, as the world is shutting down due to COVID, Morgan calls me on the phone and says, I just got the first copies.
Yeah.
And Tyler, in that moment, I had that horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. And keep in mind, I knew intellectually that the book was greenlit. I knew he was writing the book, but it wasn't until he said, I'm dropping this off so you can start reading it, so you can prepare to narrate it, that it truly sunk in that I had volunteered for this job. And then I started to read the book. And this gets to part of your question about what was my reaction to the book. 5 chapters in, I thought, oh my God, this book is so good. And I'm going to ruin it because I volunteered to do something that I've never done before. And I put the book down and I went to my laptop and I literally went to Google and typed in, how do you narrate an audiobook? It turns out there are a few different ways to narrate or a few different strategies people take.
Yeah, you don't. You hire someone else. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and at that point, I mean, and this is where it gets back to just the fascinating, even for me, of kind of hearing this from you and your shared humanity in this experience. Because the other joke, obviously, was going to make is you just hire Chris Hill to narrate your book. Because at this point, there's nobody who I know who has listened to any semblance of either podcast or financial news who wouldn't think your voice was just dialed for this. And you had gotten to the point where you had hosted over 3,500 episodes of Motley Money, covering daily markets through a long-term lens. And I want to shift gears just a little bit, kind of thinking that with that many episodes under your belt professionally, after all of that, what was the thing, kind of speaking of what brings us together, what was the thing that investors tended to obsess over the most that in your mind matters the least? And then in turn, what's the thing they almost completely ignore that you think matters enormously?
I think the thing that individual investors, and with the encouragement of the professional community, and it's one of those things that I think is just sort of the system that we're in as investors. I think the mythical idea of the hot stock or the stock that nobody knows about, sort of the excitement. It all comes under the umbrella of excitement. I think there are too many investors who obsess over the excitement of investing, and it's made more complicated and some would argue worse by apps on our phone that just make it really easy to trade stocks.
Yeah.
And sort of the gamification, that's the thing that I think is unfortunate, that so many people still are excited about the gamification of investing, and or they feel like a great stock is one that no one else has heard about, when in fact the opposite is true. That the great stocks to own over the last 30 years are almost, to an individual company, are almost all businesses that we've all heard of, we all know about. They all stand the test of time.
And did you ever, when you were on Motley Fool, did you ever try to combat that excitement? Because just fully transparently, my listening to the Motley Fool Money overlapped with my time as a portfolio manager. And I'd be lying if I didn't tell you I listen to the show on a regular basis to try to get some ideas every now and again. And I would leave the show going, this was great. They were really excited about company A or company B. And I got a very good understanding of the earnings report, et cetera. This was great. So how did you both play into, potentially, if you did, that excitement and knowing that an audience would like that, and also trying to potentially be a responsible podcaster in the financial field and help people understand that the excitement isn't necessarily the emotion that they want to foster when thinking through long-term financial moves?
We tried to do it in a few different ways. And again, with both Market Foolery and Motley Fool Money, these are news-driven shows. And so the headlines, to a large extent, dictate what we're going to talk about on the show that day. And so I would sometimes, walk up to an analyst who was going to be on the show that day and say, hey, just so you know, Apple reported earnings. We have to talk about it. And usually the analyst would be fine with that. Every once in a while, the news of the day would be a company that they didn't really follow and, talk about, well, okay, do I need to get someone else to be on the show? Because we got to talk about this. So part of it was just sort of the news drives the show. But we also tried to build in segments to enable the analysts the opportunity to talk about businesses that don't really get as much sunlight, that aren't as dominant. Mm-hmm. There's a segment that I think they still do today on Motley Fool Money called Stocks on Our Radar, which was a way for analysts to just say, here's a stock I'm looking at and here's why. We would also do episodes that were specifically geared towards boring companies, stocks that maybe your parents owned that you should think about owning too.
Yeah.
Because it really was part of the ethos of just trying to push back on the hot stock or, sort of the meme stock of the day, that kind of thing. We're just saying, like, Well, no, let's actually talk about the fundamentals underneath and what's actually driving this business. There was an educational component that we were trying to bring to the table.
This episode is brought to you by Copilot Money. I have a group chat with 4 of my closest friends from my finance days. Between the 5 of us, we have decades of experience managing other people's money, multiple licenses, and, I say this with love, a genuinely embarrassing amount of opinions about expense ratios. These are not people who download budgeting apps. These are people who tend to mock budgeting apps. Yet, every single one of them uses Copilot Money, unprompted, voluntarily. One of them texted me last month just to say, and I quote, "I finally feel like my financial life is in one place," from a guy who used to manage 8-figure portfolios. Here's why people who actually know money keep landing on this one. It tracks your spending, net worth, investments, savings goals, and budgets in one place. And it's genuinely beautiful to look at, which shouldn't matter, but absolutely does when you're trying to build a habit. It automatically categorizes transactions, which means you'll stop pretending you'll sort your bank statements this weekend. It tracks your subscriptions, so you'll finally find that streaming service you forgot you had, and the gym membership you've been emotionally lying to yourself about since February. It works across iPhone, iPad, Mac, and their web app, and they don't sell your data. It's the only personal finance app to win an Apple Editor's Choice Award, was a finalist for the Apple Design Awards, and holds a 4.8-star rating from over 25,000 reviews. Which means it's not just the finance nerds in my group chat. It's a lot of regular people who downloaded it and never deleted it. That is genuinely the hardest thing to accomplish in this category. Go to try.copilot.money/Tyler and use code Tyler2 to get 2 free months of Copilot Money. That's try.copilot.money/Tyler using code Tyler2. That's TYLER and the number 2. Your new show shifts a little bit away from kind of more of the, I would call it the CFA type curriculum of analysis and earnings reports, and is more focused on the financial anxiety that is universal with a lot of us, and a path to financial independence that you claim is simpler than it's presented. And so I'm really curious, especially because you've spent so much of your professional career talking about this, writing about this, thinking about this, sharing this with others. After about 26 years inside the most prominent investing brand in the country, is simpler than it looks genuinely your conclusion about money? Or is that just something you kind of wanted to be catchy with in the podcast trailer?
It's both. It really, my friend Jason Moser, who's an investment analyst at the Motley Fool, and I interviewed him for Money Unplugged last year. He has my favorite line on this topic, which is, he always says, investing is as simple or as complicated as you would like to make it.
Oh, I love that.
There are plenty of very successful investors who just put money away every 2 weeks into broad market index funds, and that's it. They don't want to pick stocks. And they don't need to pick stocks because they're investing in the S&P 500 or the QQQ. They're taking the broad index approach, and that works. And the longer you do it, the more successful you're going to be doing it. But there are people who are interested in finding great companies and looking for market-beating returns, not just market returns, but market-beating returns. And so it really just comes down to, what is your risk tolerance? What is your appetite for this? How much time do you want to spend on this?
Yeah.
There are people who want to spend a lot of time. There are people like my older sister who her entire adult life she and her husband have just been putting money away in index funds, and she's thrilled to do that.
Well, and I always equate it to, even just thinking on the nutritional level, is anytime you hear somebody tell you what is and is not healthy, every one of us says, yes, we know. Of course, right. We all know. And yet, if you look at our daily financial intakes, my guess, or maybe just speaking for myself, my guess is I could do better. And I know I could do better. So is there any financial behavior or belief from your own life that you know darn well intellectually is wrong, but you still catch yourself doing?
There's one big one. I was heartened by the fact that when I interviewed Dan Pink for my show, he talked about the exact same thing. And it's paying off the mortgage early.
Yeah.
My wife and I had a beautiful mortgage with a low interest rate. We bought our house in 1997. We refinanced as mortgage rates went down. We had a gorgeous mortgage, Tyler. And you don't need an advanced degree in math or economics to know that the move is to just keep that mortgage for 30 years.
Yep.
And take the excess money you have and put it into index funds or individual stocks and really grow your investment that way. And I did not do that. I went the route of paying off the mortgage early. And it really comes down to something that I always talked about on Motley Money and still talk about today, the sleep factor. If you're losing sleep over your investments and your finances, you're doing it wrong. It's your body telling you in the middle of the night you're doing it wrong. And so that's a financial behavior that I know mathematically was just the wrong move, but helps me sleep at night.
Yeah. Appreciated. And you're speaking to someone who will stay in his house for as long as possible because he locked in at a 3% 30-year fixed.
There you go.
And I'm on the other side where I'm going, I will die on this cross that I will sleep better knowing that I can get something better for some other amount. There's an opportunity cost out there if I pay this down. And it's funny because you also, that's exactly how Housel finishes Psychology with Money as well. He said in his conclusion, I believe here, Mark, and after all that, after everything I just told you, just know I paid off my 2.5% mortgage early. And you go, what? You just told me not to do that.
Right. Yeah.
But so I want to get back to your bio again, just a little bit. One of the things I found was that you are described as a part-time connoisseur of movies, basketball, and fine bourbon. And I want to try to tie all three of these together in one question. What's the best investment you've ever made? And you can answer using obviously bourbon, box office, or box score terms. I'll take any.
Boy, it's tough to think about the best investment I've made in bourbon. So I'm just going to put that one to the side for now. I think in terms of movies, the best investment I've made is watching movies with my kids. And all three of them are in their 20s now. And part of that is, when they're little, it's taking them to see a Pixar movie in the theater, that sort of thing. But then as they get older, it's showing them, in some cases, classic movies like Casablanca and saying, put away your phone. We're going to watch this movie. But also just rewatching movies with them because there are movies like Ocean's 11 that just we've seen so many times as a family.
Brilliant film.
It just becomes shorthand language around the house. Here's one with basketball, and this actually, plays into something that I asked you about when you were kind enough to come on my show, just sort of the idea of splurging. The year is 2003. Michael Jordan is playing his last season of professional basketball in the NBA. He's playing for the Washington Wizards. The season was almost over, and one of my good friends said, hey, Jordan's probably going to retire at the end of this year. We should go to one of those games. And we didn't just sit at the top of the arena. Tyler, we literally sat in the last row. And I was watching the Jumbotron as much as I was watching the action on the court, just because we were so far away from the court.
Yes.
And when we were leaving, I said to my friend, I think we would have been better off just going to a bar and watching the game there on a television, because that's kind of what we did. After that experience, because I don't go to a lot of professional sporting events. I'll go to, maybe 3 or 4 a year, a couple of baseball games, a couple of basketball games. But after that experience, I vowed I'm going to splurge on tickets. If I'm going to go to a professional game, I'm going to pay up so I can sit closer, and I'm probably going to overpay in some cases, but that's just sort of the approach I'm going to take. I'm a big fan of the saying, when you don't get what you want, you get experience.
Yes.
And with that Michael Jordan game, got the experience that sort of taught me, all right, it's time to take a different approach to live sporting events.
That is fantastic. That's a great takeaway, and it actually ties in perfectly that you bring up Jordan, because I know that one of the books that you and I both share an affinity for is Phil Knight's Shoe Dog.
Yes.
And for those of you who don't know, this is basically the story, the nonfiction story, the founding of Nike. And you have been able to use this book, much to my envy. I am so jealous of this, in some of your events with current college students and young entrepreneurs when you connect with them. Why do you use that book in particular as a teaching tool? And what is it about Knight's journey that you want the next generation to hear?
I'm going to compare it to another nonfiction book, Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis, which I believe won the Pulitzer Prize the year it came out, early 2000s. Joseph Ellis wrote this book, Founding Brothers, about the first decade of the United States of America, because, part of the premise is, well, what are we taught when we're in grade school? Like, well, we wrote the Declaration of Independence, and we went to war with the British, and we won the Revolutionary War, and then boom, we had America, and it's the shining beacon of democracy around the world. And Ellis wrote this book about the first decade that the United States was the United States, and the relationship between George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, and how those relationships kept this very fragile democracy from disintegrating. And you don't need to be a sports fan to just look at Nike and recognize this is one of the iconic brands on the entire planet. And what I love about Shoe Dog is kind of like Founding Brothers, is it's the origin story of Nike. It's the first 15 to 20 years when the business is struggling and fragile and on the verge of collapse over and over and over again. And why I mention it, particularly to college students and anyone who's thinking about starting their own business, is I think it's the best example that I've read of what it really means to be an entrepreneur. How badly you have to want it, how badly you have to work, the blood, sweat, and tears that go into whatever idea it is that you have, and how hard you have to fight for it, not just with the competition, but also in some cases with people who are trying to support you, whether it's people who are working for you or investors that you have. And it's an incredible book, and I can't recommend it highly enough.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you. It is that and Housel sit on my shelf as kind of the two that I vacillate between on any given day, depending on what mood I'm in. And I want to close with, thinking of mood, and I'm sure that you got this a lot on Motley Fool Money, and I am curious how you responded to it time and time again. Is obviously right now, you had mentioned that that Shoe Dog is potentially about Nike's being on the verge of collapse. Equally, I'm getting a lot of questions right now. Am I still investing in index funds? Am I still sticking to some of these good, solid, basic money foundational principles based on where the current climate is today and how things are going geopolitically and administratively? What is it, not obviously getting particular per se, but what is it that you would say to people when time and again, whether it was 2008, when they would write in and say, what do we do now? How do we respond now?
I'm going to go back and answer a question you asked earlier, because I realize now that I did not answer it, because earlier you asked, what is the thing investors, when I was hosting this show, that they would obsess, too much about, and
Yes.
What was the thing that they ignored? The thing that they ignored, and it's also the answer to this question, time in the market. The importance of time in the market. It's Charlie Munger's great quote about compounding, where he says the first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And as hard as it can be, as experienced as I am as an investor, which is just a polite way of saying as old as I am, and as long as I've been investing, it still hurts. And I say that to college students all the time. they're like, oh, does it get easier? It's like, well, it kind of gets easier because the longer you invest, the more I think you start to recognize patterns and you recognize bear markets and you've lived through them. So you you can sort of weather those storms again. But it's never good. It's never a good feeling to, look at the end of the day, oh, how'd the market do? It's like, oh, it's all red.
Yeah.
Every index is down 1.5%, 2%, that sort of thing. And so finding ways to put those emotions aside and recognize that the longer you can hang in there, the more time you spend in the market and you don't interrupt that compounding unnecessarily, the more you're going to be rewarded.
Chris, I think the thing that I'm most thankful for is that you're still creating and you're still producing, because genuinely, I know I said this to you before the show, but you are the reason that I started listening to podcasts in the first place. You're one of the people who was speaking my language about money, even the way that you've been doing it through the show. I'm sure people really appreciate it. And I just want to thank you not only for what you've been doing in this space, but also that you're still going with the podcast Money Unplugged. And I would really encourage folks to dive into that. If you get a chance, it is far better than what I try to produce, but I do my best. And I just want to say you are someone who I owe a massive debt of gratitude for. And I just want to thank you for taking the time today to connect both with me, to share this with me, and to share it with my audience.
Oh, that's really kind, Tyler, and I appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Have a good day, Chris.
You too.
Thanks for tuning in to your Money Guide on the Side. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to visit my website at tylergardner.com for even more helpful resources and insights. And if you are interested in receiving some quick and actionable guidance each week, don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter, where each Sunday I share 3 actionable financial ideas to help you take control of your money and investments. You can find the sign-up link on my website, tylergardner.com, or on any of my socials at socialcapofficial. Until next time, I'm Tyler Gardner, your money guide on the side, and I truly hope this episode got you one step closer to where you need to be.